The cold sting of the Chthorian shackles bit into Sergeant Jack Ryland's wrists as he was hauled through the metallic corridors of their ship. Around him, the towering reptilian guards barked orders in their guttural language, their scales glinting under the harsh, fluorescent lights. Jack's mind raced, trying to catalog every detail of his surroundings. He had been trained for moments like this, though he never expected to find himself in the clutches of the Chthorians, one of the galaxy's most feared races. Jack had been sent on a routine reconnaissance mission to an uncharted sector near Chthorian-controlled space. When his squad's stealth shuttle malfunctioned, they were ambushed. Jack was the only survivor, dragged away from the wreckage while his crewmates were either slaughtered or left for dead. Now, he was in the belly of their warship, surrounded by alien captors who viewed him as nothing more than a prize. His reputation as one of the Union's finest war medics meant nothing here. To them, he was just another fragile human, soft and weak, a misunderstanding Jack planned to exploit. The guards threw him into a cell with enough force to knock the wind out of him. The door slammed shut behind them, the locks engaging with a sharp hiss. The dim light flickered, illuminating the chamber's cold, oppressive walls. Jack pushed himself up, his shoulders sore from the Chthorians' rough handling, and took stock of his surroundings. That's when he noticed it. In the far corner of the cell, a shadow stirred. The air grew thick with a sulfuric tang as the creature moved, its massive form coming into the weak light. Gleaming scales shimmered like molten metal, and piercing eyes, glowing faintly orange, fixed on Jack. It was enormous, easily 20 feet long from its snout to the tip of its tail. Its leathery wings were folded against its back, and its head rested on claws that could tear through reinforced steel. Jack's heart raced. He recognized the creature from his briefings, a Illyrian dragon. The Chthorians used them as weapons during their planetary conquests, though most believed the species had been hunted to near extinction. This one was clearly a trophy of war, but its scars told a story of brutal captivity. Shackles bound its limbs, and patches of its scales were dull and cracked. Its once majestic crest was torn, the edges ragged and raw. Jack backed up instinctively, pressing his back against the cold wall. The dragon's eyes followed his every move, unblinking. It let out a low rumble, the sound vibrating through the metal floor. Was it a warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? "Easy there," Jack muttered, raising his hand slowly, palms outward. He wasn't sure if the creature could understand him, but his tone was calm and measured. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dragon tilted its head, a spark of intelligence glimmering in its gaze. Jack noticed something then, a wound on its left forelimb, just above the shackle. It was inflamed and oozing, likely infected. The Chthorians didn't seem to care for their prized possessions' well-being, and the sight of the untreated injury stirred something in Jack. It reminded him of why he had joined the war effort in the first place, to save lives, no matter the species. Cautiously, Jack lowered himself to the floor, sitting cross-legged to make himself appear less threatening. The dragon watched him intently but didn't move. Jack reached into the pocket of his tattered uniform and pulled out a strip of cloth he had salvaged earlier. It wasn't much, but it might help if he could clean the wound. "I'm not your enemy," he said softly. "Looks like we're both prisoners here." The dragon exhaled sharply, a puff of smoke curling from its nostrils. Jack wasn't sure if it was a sign of approval or disdain, but at least it wasn't attacking. He placed the cloth on the ground and slid it toward the creature, stopping just a foot away from its massive claws. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the dragon's head lowered, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the offering. Slowly, it extended a talon and dragged the cloth closer, inspecting it with an almost delicate touch. Jack stayed perfectly still, his muscles tense, ready to spring back if the creature lashed out. But instead, it did something unexpected. It growled softly, almost like a purr, and laid its head back down, the cloth resting near its injured limb. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. The Chthorians had thrown him in here to die, assuming the dragon would rip him apart. But they didn't know Jack's training or his principles. He had seen too much suffering in his time as a medic to abandon anyone, even an alien dragon. Jack glanced at the creature, its eyes now half closed, but still watching him. They were both prisoners in this metal tomb, but something told him that together, they might stand a chance of escaping. All he had to do was earn its trust. And if there was one thing Jack Ryland knew how to do, it was to save the seemingly unsavable. The dim light of the cell pulsed faintly, casting long shadows over the walls. Jack Ryland sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his back pressed against the unyielding wall. Across from him, the dragon Virox, as Jack decided to call it, lay with its head resting on its massive claws, its fiery eyes fixed on him. Days had passed, but Jack couldn't be sure how many. Time was difficult to measure in the Chthorian prison. Despite the initial tension between them, Jack and Virox had come to a silent understanding. They were both captives, bound by the same oppressive force. That shared reality became the foundation of a fragile relationship, one that Jack hoped to strengthen. The dragon's wound on its forelimb continued to fester, its edges turning an angry shade of crimson. Jack knew that without intervention, the infection would spread, endangering the creature's life. He had no medkit, no antiseptics, and no proper tools, but Jack's training taught him to improvise. As Virox watched, Jack tore a strip of fabric from his already ragged uniform. He approached the creature slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Virox growled low in its throat, a warning, but it didn't lash out. "I'm just trying to help," Jack said, holding up his hands. "If I don't do something about that wound, it's going to kill you." The dragon rumbled, the sound vibrating through the cell. Jack wasn't sure if it understood his words, but something in its gaze seemed to soften. It lifted its forelimb slightly, exposing the wound. Jack took that as permission. Kneeling beside the massive creature, Jack worked quickly. He used water from his canteen to clean the area, wiping away grime and dried blood. Virox flinched but didn't pull away. Jack whispered calming words, his voice steady, though his hands trembled. The sheer size of the dragon made him feel like an insect tending to a mountain, but he focused on the task. Once the wound was cleaned, Jack wrapped the makeshift bandage around it, tying it as securely as he could. The dragon huffed, a puff of warm air washing over him. Jack sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. "There," he said, meeting the dragon's gaze. "Not perfect, but it's a start." Virox rumbled again, this time softer. Jack could have sworn it was a sound of gratitude. Over the following days, their bond deepened. Jack offered small bits of his rations to Virox, breaking pieces of the bland protein bars the Chthorians provided. The dragon accepted them carefully, its sharp teeth never coming close to Jack's hand. In return, Virox began to share its warmth, curling its body closer to Jack during the cell's cold nights. Communication between them evolved. Virox seemed to understand Jack's gestures and tone, responding with growls, huffs, and the occasional flick of its tail. Jack started talking to the dragon as if it were an old friend, telling stories of Earth, of rolling green hills, vast oceans, and the twinkling cityscapes of humanity's colonies. One evening, Jack noticed something strange. As he described Earth's sunsets, Virox's eyes glowed brighter, and the dragon shifted, stretching its wings slightly. Its claws traced a pattern on the floor, a series of shapes that looked almost like constellations. "You know the stars," Jack murmured, his voice filled with wonder. "You've been out there, haven't you?" Virox let out a deep, resonant sound, something between a growl and a hum. Jack watched as the dragon etched more patterns into the floor. Some were familiar maps of star systems Jack recognized from his training. Others were completely alien. It dawned on him that Virox wasn't just intelligent, it was deeply knowledgeable. This creature had seen more of the universe than Jack could imagine. As their bond grew, Jack began to notice changes in the dragon. Its wound healed faster than he expected, the infection subsiding and the scales around the injury regaining their metallic sheen. Virox's movements became less sluggish, its posture more regal. The dragon seemed to draw strength from their connection, as though the simple act of companionship was enough to reignite its spirit. But it wasn't just Virox who changed. Jack, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. His initial despair at being captured had given way to determination. He and Virox were more than prisoners now, they were allies. And allies didn't abandon each other. One day, as Jack leaned against the wall, idly tracing patterns in the dirt with his finger, Virox rumbled and nudged him gently with its snout. Startled, Jack looked up to see the dragon gesturing toward the cell door with its head. It growled softly, then extended its talon and scratched a mark on the wall, a jagged, jaguar-like shape that resembled the Chthorian guard's insignia. "You've been watching them," Jack realized. "You know their patterns." Virox growled again, this time with a note of urgency. Jack's mind raced. If Virox could recognize the guard's routines, they might have a chance, a slim, desperate chance to escape. Jack knelt beside the dragon, placing a hand on its massive shoulder. "You've been biding your time, haven't you?" he asked softly. "Waiting for someone to help you." The dragon huffed, its warm breath washing over him. Jack took that as confirmation. "Well, Virox," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling in his chest, "I think it's time we gave these Chthorians a taste of their own medicine." The dragon rumbled, a deep, resonant sound that echoed like thunder. Jack felt a flicker of hope. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were partners, and together, they might just have a fighting chance. The faint vibrations of the Chthorian warship's engines thrummed through the cell floor as Jack and Virox prepared. The human medic had spent days studying the guards' patrols and their routines with Virox's help. The dragon, with its sharp senses and keen intelligence, had noticed patterns Jack wouldn't have spotted alone, which guards relax when the patrols changed, and even the peculiar delay in security sweeps during supply drops. All of it pointed to one opportunity: an incoming stop at a desolate asteroid mining station. "Timing is everything," Jack muttered, his voice low as he crouched beside Virox. The dragon rumbled softly in agreement, its fiery eyes focused on the cell door. Jack glanced at the makeshift tools he had fashioned from scraps: a broken pipe he had pried loose, a sharp fragment of plating from the corner of the cell, and a stolen energy baton that one of the guards had carelessly left near the door during a routine check. "We'll only get one shot at this," Jack continued. "I distract the guards, you take out the power relay. If we can get the door open, we head for the hangar. You ready?" Virox let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the air like a promise. Jack grinned despite himself. "I'll take that as a yes." The opportunity came just as they had planned. The ship shuddered slightly, signaling its approach to the asteroid station. Jack heard the familiar clang of the external locks disengaging as the Chthorian guards prepared for the supply transfer. Two guards approached their cell, their reptilian forms silhouetted against the harsh corridor lights. Jack forced himself to look weak, slumping against the wall and clutching his stomach. He groaned loudly, drawing their attention. "What's wrong with the human?" one guard growled in its guttural tongue. The other guard hissed dismissively. "Probably sick from our food. Let him rot." Jack groaned louder, feigning pain. "Water. Please," he gasped, reaching toward them with trembling fingers. He had to get them to step inside the cell. The first guard hesitated, then snarled. Pathetic creature. It keyed open the cell door and stepped inside, the second guard standing watch just outside. As the first guard leaned over Jack, a blur of motion erupted from the corner. Virox lunged, its massive claws tearing through the air. The guard didn't even have time to scream before it was slammed into the wall with a sickening crunch. The second guard turned, raising its weapon, but Jack was faster. He swung the stolen energy baton, hitting the guard square in the chest. The alien convulsed as electricity surged through its body, collapsing in a heap. Jack didn't waste a second. He grabbed the fallen guard's weapon and tossed it to Virox, who crushed it beneath its claw. "Nice work," Jack said, his adrenaline pumping. Virox rumbled in agreement, nudging Jack toward the corridor. They moved quickly, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Chthorian ship. Jack relied on Virox's keen senses to avoid patrols, the dragon's low growls signaling when to stop and wait. They passed rows of cells containing other captured creatures, but Jack's heart sank. Most of them were either too injured or too hostile to risk releasing. "Can't save everyone," Jack whispered to himself, though the guilt gnawed at him. Finally, they reached the power relay station. A cluster of exposed conduits glowed faintly with alien energy. Virox moved forward, its massive jaws clamping down on the cables. Sparks flew, and the lights flickered as the dragon ripped the conduits apart, plunging the ship into darkness. Alarms began to blare, but Jack knew this would work to their advantage. "Hangars this way," he shouted, leading Virox down a narrow corridor. The hangar bay was a chaotic sprawl of activity. Chthorian guards shouted orders, their weapons glinting in the flashing red emergency lights. Ships of various sizes were docked, some bristling with weapons, others sleek and fast. "There." Jack pointed to a small scout ship. It wasn't built for comfort, but it was their best chance at escape. As they sprinted toward it, the guard spotted them. A volley of plasma bolts streaked through the air, narrowly missing Jack. Virox roared, unleashing a torrent of flame that engulfed the nearest group of guards. The heat was intense, forcing Jack to shield his face as they pushed forward. Jack reached the scout ship first, scrambling to open the hatch. The controls were alien, but he had learned enough from his time in captivity to bypass the basic security lock. Come on," he muttered as the hatch hissed open. Virox covered him, its massive tail sweeping through a group of approaching guards like a wrecking ball. The dragon roared again, a deafening sound that sent the remaining Chthorians scattering. Jack climbed into the cockpit and powered up the ship. The engines roared to life as Virox leapt onto the ship's hull, curling its body tightly around it. The Chthorian guards rallied, their weapons locking onto the scout ship. Plasma bolts streaked toward them, but Virox opened its jaws and unleashed a blast of fire so intense that it melted the guards' weapons and sent them fleeing for cover. Jack grinned, gripping the controls. "Hang on, Virox." With a deafening roar, the scout ship lifted off, blasting out of the hangar. The Chthorians' larger vessels attempted to pursue, but the scout ship was fast and maneuverable. Jack weaved through the asteroid field, using the debris for cover as Virox clung tightly to the hull. Finally, they broke free of the Chthorian fleet, the stars stretching out before them like a sea of endless possibilities. Jack leaned back in the cockpit, his heart pounding. "We did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Virox rumbled from the hull, its glowing eyes visible through the cockpit window. Jack smiled. They were free, but he knew this was just the beginning of their journey. Together, they would forge a path through the stars, two unlikely allies bound by survival and an unshakable bond. The scout ship hummed softly as it cruised through uncharted space, far beyond the reach of the Chthorian fleet. Jack sat in the pilot's seat, his fingers gliding over the unfamiliar controls. The cockpit was cramped but functional, with a viewport that stretched wide, revealing the vast expanse of stars ahead. Virox rested on the ship's hull, its massive frame curled protectively around the vessel, a living shield against any threat they might encounter. Jack leaned back, exhaling slowly. The adrenaline of their escape had worn off, leaving him with a mix of relief and unease. They were free, but the galaxy was vast and filled with dangers. "You all right out there, big guy?" Jack said, his voice crackling over the ship's external comm system. Virox rumbled in response, the sound resonating through the ship like distant thunder. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll take that as a yes." Their first priority was finding a safe place to regroup. The scout ship had limited resources, barely enough food, water, and fuel to last a few days. Jack scanned the ship's navigational database, a patchwork of Chthorian star charts and outdated planetary logs. One system stood out, a red dwarf star with a single habitable planet. It was far from major trade routes, which made it an ideal place to lay low. "All right, Virox," Jack said, inputting the coordinates. "Let's see what's waiting for us out there." The planet, which the Chthorian logs referred to as Zyrith 4, loomed ahead, a vibrant swirl of greens and blues. As they entered the atmosphere, the ship shuddered, its aging thrusters straining against the pull of gravity. Virox let out a concerned growl, and Jack gritted his teeth. "Hold on, we're almost there." The ship broke through the clouds, revealing a lush landscape of dense forests and rolling hills. Jack spotted a clearing near a river and guided the ship down, the landing gear groaning as it made contact with the soft earth. The engines powered down with a sputtering whine, and silence enveloped them. Jack stepped out of the cockpit, his boots crunching against the grass. He inhaled deeply, the air fresh and tinged with the scent of vegetation. Virox climbed down from the hull, its massive form dwarfing the ship. The dragon stretched its wings, letting out a deep, resonant roar that echoed across the valley. Jack smirked. "Yeah, I'd say that's an improvement from our last accommodations." Over the next few days, Jack and Virox settled into their new environment. The planet was rich with resources, fresh water, edible plants, and small creatures that Virox hunted with precision. Jack rigged a makeshift shelter from parts of the scout ship, creating a base of operations where he could assess their next move. Virox seemed to thrive on the planet, its scales regaining their full luster and its movements becoming more fluid and powerful. Jack marveled at the creature's resilience. It wasn't just surviving, it was healing, becoming stronger with each passing day. But Jack knew their reprieve couldn't last forever. The Chthorians wouldn't forget their escape. If they tracked the ship's trajectory, it was only a matter of time before they found them. One evening, as Jack sat by a fire, Virox approached, its glowing eyes reflecting the flames. The dragon nudged Jack gently with its snout, then etched a pattern in the dirt with its claw. Jack leaned forward, studying the intricate design. It was a star chart, but not one he recognized. "This isn't the Chthorian map," Jack murmured, tracing the lines with his finger. "Is this where you're from?" Virox let out a low, mournful rumble. Jack looked up at the dragon, his brow furrowing. "You're trying to go home, aren't you?" The dragon nodded in unmistakable, deliberate motion. Jack felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on survival that he hadn't considered Virox's deeper needs. This wasn't just about escaping captivity. Virox had lost its home, its freedom, and likely its kind. It had fought to survive, just as Jack had, but now it wanted more. Jack placed a hand on the dragon's massive shoulder. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "We'll find your home. Together." Using the star chart Virox had drawn, Jack worked tirelessly to plot a course. It wasn't easy, the dragon's knowledge was ancient, and the galaxy had changed since it had last roamed freely. Still, Jack's training in navigation and astrophysics helped bridge the gaps. The journey took them to the edge of known space, through treacherous asteroid fields and forgotten systems. They encountered pirates, hostile alien species, and uncharted phenomena, but together, Jack and Virox overcame every challenge. Virox's sheer power and Jack's ingenuity proved an unstoppable combination. Eventually, they reached a system that matched Virox's star chart. A vibrant nebula swirled around a dying star, its light casting an ethereal glow over the planets orbiting it. One planet stood out, a massive world covered in jagged peaks and glowing rivers of molten lava. Virox let out a triumphant roar, its wings spreading wide as they approached. "This is it, isn't it?" Jack said, his voice filled with awe. "This is your home." As they descended, Jack noticed the remnants of ancient structures carved into the mountains. Virox landed gracefully, its claws digging into the volcanic soil. The dragon's eyes scanned the landscape, a mix of recognition and sorrow. Jack stepped down beside it, placing a hand on its leg. "We did it," he said softly. "You're home." But the moment was bittersweet. The planet was desolate, its once thriving ecosystems reduced to harsh extremes. Virox let out a mournful cry, the sound echoing across the empty peaks. Jack's chest tightened. It was a reminder of the cost of war, the destruction wrought by the Chthorians and others like them. Still, Virox wasn't alone. It had Jack, and together they began to rebuild. Using the scout ship's equipment and the resources of the planet, Jack helped Virox create a sanctuary, a place where it could heal, and where others of its kind, if any remained, might someday return. Jack stayed, not out of obligation, but because he had found something here, a purpose greater than himself. Together, human and dragon became guardians of this forgotten world, a beacon of hope in a galaxy scarred by conflict. And as they looked up at the stars, they knew their story wasn't over. It was just beginning.